Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. You're here for performance feedback in the age of cancel culture. This is a joint program with Core Triangle Consulting and the Northwest firm. We're going to examine how our national focus on dismantling institutional bias and holding organizations accountable for failing to address those issues can have unintended and serious impacts on effective talent and performance management. We're also going to identify the root causes and the legal and practical risks associated with failing to provide candid and direct performance feedback. We're going to offer performance management tips and strategies that are effective and which elevate rather than undermine your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. My name is Allison Kahn. I am a labor and employment attorney at Carlton Fields, and I am going to be your moderator today. Thank you all for being here. We will have time for questions and answers, either at the end of each topic or at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and ask any questions you want. Don't be shy. I promise I will not identify you by name unless you specifically state in the chat that it's okay to identify you by name. So please don't be shy and ask whatever questions you would like and whatever's on your mind. So let me introduce you to our two panelists today. The first person I'd like to introduce you to, who you see on your screen, is Ray Van. Ray is a shareholder at Carlton Fields and the Washington, D.C. office. She practices labor and employment law with an emphasis on equal employment opportunity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and federal contractor affirmative action compliance. She is here today in her capacity as Vice President of Core Triangle Consulting, which is the firm's affiliated HR and organizational risk management consulting company. Core Triangle helps clients with a range of human resource, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other employment and organizational risk mitigation needs, from the routine to the most unique strategic issues facing organizations right now. And also, let me introduce you to Natalie Northwest. Natalie is from the Northwest firm. She is a creative and proven problem solver with nearly 20 years of experience counseling employers on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and HR strategies, compliance, and litigation. Natalie has worked with global employers in various industries, including quick service restaurants, manufacturing, financial services, and healthcare. Natalie firmly believes that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or human resource strategies, and draws on her varied experiences to customize strategies that are unique to an organization. And for those of you who might not be as familiar with the acronym DEI, which is what you are going to hear a lot of today, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Natalie and Ray are going to begin by laying the foundation with a background and giving some contextual information. Then they're going to jump into this idea of cancel culture and what it means and how it's impacted corporate behavior in good and not so good ways. Then they're going to talk about the legal and practical implications from HR, EEO compliance, and DEI perspectives. And we're going to identify strategies and best practices for avoiding some common pitfalls. So without further ado, I will pass this off to Ray to talk about our first slide.
Thanks, Allison. We can go ahead and advance the slide. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here with Allison and Natalie to dive into this important yet somewhat under-discussed topic. So just to lay some groundwork here, we've all witnessed a sea change in perceptions of bias and equity issues within society as a whole, and in particular in the workplace, largely as a result of the groundswell of social and racial justice calls to action that followed the killing last year of George Floyd. What made his death especially significant, I think, in terms of serving as so much of a catalyst for the change that we're observing now, is that we all saw what happened. You really couldn't go anywhere without seeing actual footage or even images of others reacting to the footage. So there was really no denying what we saw, right? And I think that collective shock and outrage that stemmed from that incident and others that followed led many to start calling out people and organizations that they felt did not have their own anti-bias house in order, or who they felt needed a nudge or push in the direction of doing the right thing. So Natalie's going to talk more about this idea of cancel culture, but I just wanted to remind folks that this is not a new concept by any stretch, even in the equity context, right? I'm sure some of you have read, as I have, one or more of the articles published over the course of this past year, tracking the origins of what we now have come to call cancel culture, back really hundreds of years. At the end of the day, cancel culture, even as it's played out recently, given the ubiquity of social media, is really just, to my mind, a supercharged form of accountability that we've really seen across time. Think about, as an example, the global Me Too movement that came about a few years ago. So the movement existed for many years. It was actually started by a woman by the name of Tawana Burke, but it only became this global phenomenon after the actress Melissa Milano posted a tweet that basically urged her followers who had been victims of sexual harassment or sexual assault to respond to her tweet with a Me Too response. So what followed immediately, or at least almost immediately, were calls to action, calls for legal reform and new laws and other measures aimed to strengthen anti-harassment and sexual assault laws. Then there was also the corporate soul searching and efforts to ensure that our prevention practices were effective. And then, perhaps most relevant to the topic at hand, there was this methodical effort to smoke out basically the perpetrators of these types of actions and misconduct and to hold them accountable. So many organizations in the wake of the Me Too movement, but especially since last year's racial and social justice movements, have been grappling with pressure from within and outside their organizations to not just articulate a commitment to fairness, equity, everything that basically makes up DE&I and our strategy around DE&I, but also to demonstrate that commitment in tangible ways. With that background, let me just turn it over to Natalie.
Forgive me, I was on mute. Thanks so much, Ray. So when we frame up the context around cancel culture and why we're talking about it today, I'd like to touch upon some of the issues that we're seeing when we're talking about giving direct performance feedback. So if we could go to slide 7, please. So if we look at some of the issues, and I am in a situation and have been for almost 20 years, where almost every day, at least once a day, I'm talking to a client about a performance issue. And what I've seen, particularly in the last 18 to 24 months, is a real hesitance for people managers to give what they perceive to be negative feedback. There's also a corresponding tendency to overinflate really positive feedback that overblows some of the performance issues someone may have. And when you look at those two things together, it's not that they're completely new, right? I'm sure Ray or Allison and I can come up with many of times we may have litigated cases where, you know, we get a complaint and a manager says to us, oh, they were the worst employee ever. And I'm like, great, did you write them up? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, cool. Can I see the performance review? We get the performance review and they're above expectations. And I'm like, your documentation is not matching what you're saying. And so it's not that we've always been great about giving sort of the direct feedback, but what I'm seeing, and I think a lot of us who do this work are seeing, is that we have leaders that will avoid to be almost paralyzed by having to give feedback that someone may deem as negative. Now, I want to be clear, because I think when you're giving direct feedback where you're saying, hey, we expected this report that you provided to have XYZ components. It only addresses X. It was also 3 months late. That to me is not negative, right? It's giving someone the truth. Now, if you're adding, personal jabs at the person, that's when it can be taken to negative. But I think a lot of times people view telling someone the truth to be negative. And so what happens in these situations where there's been a culture around just being really, really nice or positive in terms of the type of feedback and not letting someone know when they're doing a poor job, is that you end up over relying on those around you. One example, I was dealing with a situation where a client hired a Black woman to do some fundraising work, not going well at all. And rather than give that woman the feedback, because there was a fear there, the hiring manager just relies more heavily on the employees that do perform. And so then that can create obviously a significant amount of resentment because the employees that do perform at some point start to notice that they're doing more than their fair share of work. The other thing that can happen is managers will rely on people who are not afraid of giving direct feedback. And in a lot of cases, we see this can happen with not only, but there is sort of this sort of subculture around a lot of people of color tend to be more direct. And so they're sort of tasked with delivering bad news, but it could be anyone. And what happens then is that if I, instead of, if I had an issue with Ray and I didn't feel like I could tell her and I asked Allison to do it for me, it undermines my credibility as a leader when I'm deferring my responsibility to give feedback to someone else. And then the last piece, which I'm seeing a lot, and it's quite unfortunate, is people work around the problem. So one example is the over-reliance on strong performers. The other examples that we see regularly are trying to make decisions that sort of change the job of the person who's not performing well so they don't have to be dealt with. Right. So instead of just saying, hey, look, you're not doing what we need to be done, we're going to give you this time to do it. It's sometimes developing other business strategies, other decisions, and you're going around in these, in sometimes circles because they're not facing it. If we look at certain contexts like law firms or accounting firms or firms in which you rely on billing clients for your time, some of what we see is just people getting shut out. Right? They don't know why they're not getting assignments and they're not making their hours because they're not getting assignments, but people are afraid to be straight up and they avoid the person. And then people in those billable hour contexts sort of just fizzle out or figure out at some point they should get another job because they don't have enough work to keep themselves busy. So when we think about why we're here, right? Because it's really important always. I'm big on figuring out root causes for problems because it's the easiest way to find the best solution. What are some of the reasons we're seeing this? So if we bring it back into this idea of cancel culture, it's interesting because everybody there's a lot of difference in terms of when it started, but the idea around sort of this, canceling someone started anywhere between 2014 and 2017. Some blame some reality shows where this came up, some blame tweets that were issued. And really, when we think about cancel culture, it's another way of talking about boycotting a person or a business or a service based on something offensive that they've done. And most most directly, this idea of cancellation shows up in the DEI space. And so we are more than ever subject to the court of public opinion. And certainly because of social media, we're in a place where things happen in like 5 seconds flat. An executive of a company in their personal capacity makes a comment about vaccination or masks or the presidential election in a one way that a group of people finds offensive, and within 5 minutes, their employer's notified. There are tweets and retweets and sharing on all platforms and social media, and it gets big really quickly. So when we think about it from that perspective, and myself having walked through situations with clients where they are being called out in social media, it underlies a fear that a lot of people have of being called out. And the fear is not, misplaced, because obviously going through it is very uncomfortable and it really forces you to look at some of your practices. But when we take a step back on that, we can think of many instances in which employees do things that really don't actually reflect completely on the employer. And so most companies are able to weather the storm when they really look at the issue being raised and the practices around it, to sort of go through it. A really great example is the incident that happened with Starbucks. It was probably like 2018, where there was 2 Black men in Philadelphia that were standing in the lobby of a Starbucks waiting for a friend, and the manager of that Starbucks called the police on them, essentially for loitering, even though they were waiting for a friend. It caused huge public outcry to the point where Starbucks closed all of its locations for a day to engage in training. And the thing I always thought was somewhat interesting about the approach was that Starbucks has one of the most built out DEI programs that I've seen in terms of really big companies. So if you went to their website then and now, you will see a very broad array of practices that they've put into place to demonstrate their commitment to DEI that were in place at this time. And what I always would say to people who are really upset about this is, I guarantee you Starbucks does not have a policy that says kick out or call the police on the 2 Black men waiting for their friend, and that you had what we would call a rogue employee who made a decision on the spot that was the wrong one. So I think that when we think about this idea of cancel culture and the fear of being caught up in that, it's important to keep in mind too that with the right response and the right approaches and having strong policies in place, it's something that you can weather. There's still a great deal of fear that people will be sued. So even if it's not something that would hit social media, I still have leaders say, well, I don't want to get sued. And I have a lot of feelings about that, because I think when we think about what's the worst case scenario, litigation is not always the worst case scenario. Not that I ever want to walk people into that, but I think when your business could suffer from the type of poor performance people are experiencing these days, litigation isn't there. And then there's a small piece of this where there are leaders, and I particularly see this with people who are newer to leading or managing, that they want their teams to accept them, to like them. And so that creates some avoidance when it comes to being direct. Another thing, I've given performance management training for many, many years. And the thing that I always say is that when you avoid giving direct feedback, again, letting people know where they're not performing, it creates 2 types of situations where I say that's not fair. It's not fair to the employee to be going on all day, every day, thinking that they're doing a good job because they're not getting feedback. As you've probably heard, if you manage people at one time or another from people like me or Ray or Allison, is people should not be surprised if they're getting terminated, right? Should not be in a room with someone who has no idea why they're being terminated. And from a litigation standpoint, I would say almost 95% of the cases that I litigated prior to walking away from litigation boiled down to a lack of communication. And so what happens is that when people aren't getting this feedback and then they're suddenly getting terminated, they fill in the blanks. Oh, well, it must be because I was a woman. It must be because I was Black. It must be because I'm part of the LGBTQ community. And there's a disconnect that it could have been part of their performance. It's also not fair to the organization itself. You're paying people to do a job that you've determined is necessary to move forward strategic objectives of the company. And if you're paying someone who's not doing the job, then the rest of the organization can suffer. So there's really, while there are some potential downsides, the upside is huge in terms of being upfront with people about how they're performing. Turn it over to Ray.
So when we talk about talent management practices and performance feedback, those things often obviously influence employment selections or directly result in employment actions that are subject to federal, state, and or local laws that regulate workplace conduct. They, establish non-discrimination rules and regulations. Federal non-discrimination laws, like Title VII as an example, clearly prohibit employers from making employment decisions based on an individual's protected traits. Really, state and local law do as well. Singling out a trans woman for unfair scrutiny or discipline because she is trans, I think everyone would agree, is an adverse employment action taken because of a legally protected characteristic. But, and this goes back to what Natalie was talking about, giving a Latino worker an inflated performance evaluation, especially when you know it's not warranted, simply out of fear that he might call you a racist on social media or sue you for race or national origin discrimination, is really no different. You're taking an employment action based on his legally protected national origin status. Now, it isn't, I suppose, facially negative in the sense that something bad will immediately flow from it, but it ultimately could be very damaging to that person or the company. So, say as an example, that person applies for a promotion based on the glowing, but entirely overblown and unbeknownst to that person, right? Overblown feedback that he's received, over the last 2 or 3 years. Maybe his supervisor was willing to, in giving that feedback, overdo it a little bit to placate the employee and frankly, to avoid being called whatever. But when push comes to shove, that supervisor isn't willing to take the business risk of moving that person into a role that he believes the employee isn't ready for. So the employee is denied the promotion, one for which he believed, based on his documented performance, he was very well qualified. So, I just challenge you, try explaining that one to the employee or to the EEOC or to a jury. It's tough. But, another example, what if this inflated evaluation situation goes on for a while until the manager is tasked with selecting employees for position elimination as a result of or as part of a company's reduction in force. So the manager goes about making selections based on what he believes are objective performance measures, and the Latino employee we were talking about is selected for RIF, position elimination. How do we explain, in defending the subsequent charge or employment discrimination lawsuit, that he was selected for performance and not race or national origin, given the fact that the performance issues that landed him on the RIF list aren't documented anywhere? Again, and going again back to what Natalie said earlier, it's unfair to the business, but it's also unfair to the employee who was not given the opportunity or the information that he needed, basically, to get to where he wants to be in his career. So I think that's a good segue into the next couple of slides, which Natalie's gonna lead us through.
So when we look at performance management and where it fits in an employee life cycle, when we think about the life cycle of an employee, I use my hands a lot. I'm noticing it because I'm on screen, but I feel like it helps to drive home the point here. So when we have a life cycle, we have from the point someone is terminated to if they retire or they're terminated, right? So that takes us around this whole circle. And you have training on there, you have performance feedback on there. And I think when you look at that, think about that continuum, performance management should be a daily occurrence. So when we think about that in terms of the import of being timely with giving feedback. I always talk about the fact that if we rely on the word expect a lot, I mean, I love that word. It makes it so easy on a daily basis to manage performance, right? I expect to get this report by Tuesday. If Tuesday comes and goes, you're saying you didn't meet the expectation of getting it to me by Tuesday. Anyone who sees that knows that whatever contract they made in the first place, so contract, so to speak, of saying, I expect this, and you're saying, okay, cool, I'm going to do that, understands what it means to not meet an expectation. So you want to give people that feedback when it happens and not waiting for performance reviews. Because again, you get to a performance review that might be 3, 6 months or a year after an issue. It's not fresh in the mind of the employee. They start to feel like you're making things up about them, or that it's because they complained about something or something else happened that you're now giving them feedback. And so dealing with things in the moment is the easiest way to move this forward. And sometimes people need more than just a second chance, right? We talk about this a lot in the context of a performance improvement plan. Sometimes we call us HR nerds call a PIP. But when we think about a performance improvement plan, the idea is, frankly, to help set someone up to grow out of whatever issues you may be seeing of them. And so this, when we say giving someone a second, third, and fourth chance as appropriate, it's possible that there are situations where the scope of the role changes. Sometimes maybe the law, if they're in a compliance position, the law has changed, so the target that they were moving for has to change. But I also think it's important to not throw in performance improvement plans as some sort of last-ditch effort to paper the file on whether someone's been doing a good or bad job. So I'll get clients that'll say, we're really just tired of this person. They've been underperforming. They talk to their colleagues badly. They're not good with customers. We want to put them on a PIP. And I'm like, well, what are you going to put them on a PIP for, right? Like, if this has been going on for months and months, what do you think is going to happen if you give them 30 days or 45 days to perform, to change? Like, the faith, you've lost faith in the person. And so, I'd much rather deal with the potential consequence of not having maybe properly papered the file than to create more hostility and anger with what would probably be viewed as a superficial or not real performance improvement plan. Then we get to like the coaching and development opportunities. And this is, again, if we're thinking about the life cycle, sometimes employees just aren't properly trained. And sometimes they need external support more than you can give them. And so this is why I think being really thoughtful about what you need from an employee versus what you're getting versus what you hope to get after having the conversation should also include whether or not there are some external opportunities that they can take part in to help improve skills or the ways in which they're approaching their jobs. And then I think the last piece, when we look at this all together in terms of just the impact on the organization and credibility, managers who regularly don't give direct feedback start to lose credibility after a few employees of doing this with, right? Where they'll come and they'll be like, oh, this person's terrible. And you'll be like, let me guess, but you haven't told them. And it's like, well, yeah, I didn't want to, cause this, that, and the other. And then it means that they're not being accountable to the work. We have a situation that we dealt with recently where a lower level employee was making really significant errors in some costs that they got reimbursed for by a local government. And this had been going on for months and materialized in the employee with not following the city's procedures. The organization lost about $60,000. And $60,000 is a lot of money, right? And so the CEO of the organization has said that while, yes, this person that made the mistakes needs to go, the managers overseeing that person also need to be accountable because they were overseeing the work, let it go, right? Even though they knew that this person was prone to errors. And so ultimately, this becomes more about the manager at some point than the employee who's misperforming because the manager is tolerating poor performance. And so when we put that all together, it's, if you're looking at each day you show up to work to move forward some business initiative, whether it be for your clients, whether it be for the company itself, how can we make sure that we are moving together as a unit when that happens, as opposed to waiting for things to blow up internally or become impossible to manage because this feedback has not been given. To move forward.
Natalie, before we go on, I just want to crystallize and reinforce the importance of good written documentation practices. So a lot of organizations, as you know, really for the last 8 to 10 years have been moving away from sort of that formal written performance evaluation process in favor of what you described, the ongoing coaching and feedback. But there comes a point at which documentation is appropriate and necessary. And, you know, as you teed up, the documentation serves a number of roles. First and foremost, it provides the employee with notice, right? Information about the things that they're doing really well and should continue. You know, information about things that should be improved or areas of ongoing growth. And then perhaps, you know, information about actions or conduct that should be discontinued, right? So as you said, the notice allows the employee to develop into those areas and improve, and also to seek out feedback and assistance, either from their manager or others, or to take up suggestions that the manager should be making as part of that performance feedback to develop in a positive way. And then obviously not to be overly lawyerly about it, but obviously good documentation also is a key to legal risk mitigation, right? To the extent, as you said, that a dispute, you know, or litigation arises in the future, you know, if Billy's let go for performance based on a long documented history of deficiencies, having that contemporaneous but accurate documentation certainly will be helpful in defending the employer's actions if challenged in court. And then on the other hand, of course, bad documentation. I've said for years and years in training and developing HR managers that I'd rather see no documentation sometimes than bad documentation, like the inflated performance evaluation, because as you said, it could and likely will, and actually most certainly will, raise credibility and pretext problems for the employer. I cannot leave the subject without providing an example that I experienced very early on in my career when I was investigating discrimination claims. I remember, and back then it was all paper, you know, there was no internet, all that kind of stuff. I'm dating myself, but I remember reviewing a copy of, I guess, the person who filed the complaint, her resume. And she was claiming that she was maybe sexually harassed or something like that. And I look on the resume and there's this little notation in the corner, top right corner, and it just says GL. And I'm scratching my head. I'm like, it's not her initials. Those aren't the initials of her manager or the hiring manager. What is GL? What does that mean? And it finally came out during the fact-finding conference. GL stood for good looking. So the hiring manager just wanted to remember that he needed to go back to that one because that's the one that he thought was hot. I mean, just stuff like that. And you think, you know, it's fiction, but it happens. And then the other good practice that I want to mention before we move on is the importance of monitoring feedback, both written and oral, right? For possible indicators of implicit bias or even explicit bias, right? What kinds of words, and you teed this up earlier, Natalie, you know, what kind of words are being used? How does the manager's performance feedback compare across all of her direct reports? You know, maybe documentation strategies and techniques should be the topic of our next webinar, Natalie, because we could go on and on about that. I do see that there's a question in the queue as well that perhaps we should tackle before we move on.
The question from an anonymous attendee is, when corrections are made to work product, it seems that the employee should understand that there was a failure in expectation. However, it seems that employees may not recognize that there is constructive feedback embedded within the corrections. So how do you make that known to the employee without it being viewed as too critical?
You know, I'd love to take this one just because we brought up this example when we were preparing. When I was a first year associate and I would get a brief back from a partner with a bunch of red pen, it very much sent a painful signal to my heart that I did something wrong. And so, you know, I think that the reality, especially in the legal industry, is that we aren't typically giving lots of feedback because we have lots of hours to bill. We're busy with clients. But I think that when you're first working with someone, whether it be in the law firm context or any other context, and you get work product from them that does not meet your expectations, rather than just sending it back with all these changes or comments, it's worth a 15-minute conversation of saying, you know, this work is missed the mark in these 3 ways. And so I want to make sure that we just take a few minutes to talk through it to make sure see if how you understood the direction you were given. Maybe I wasn't clear. And let's talk through sort of where we go from here. Taking that 15, 20 minutes, most people will greatly appreciate because no one wants to be doing the wrong thing. But it also saves the person assigning the work a significant amount of frustration, and you're not assuming that the person knows that just because you made corrections, there is a problem. I mean, an alternative example to that is I worked for partners who it really didn't matter how you wrote it. They wanted to add their own spin to things. And so I didn't take personally that they may have made changes to briefs I wrote or memos to a client because they have their own style that they want to imbue in the process. So just because you make a change, it doesn't actually mean that what the work that the person did was bad or wrong. It may just be stylistic different. And to the extent it was bad or wrong, it's best to just get out ahead of it so that there's a sort of an understanding for the next time that they're responsible for turning in some work product to you.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And as to the issue of trying not to appear too critical, this is about constructive criticism. So there's going to be positive along with the areas of opportunity that you're pointing out to the employee. And managers are loath to have these conversations. They can be very deeply uncomfortable. But if you're returning a document, and I will say that I never, ever returned, say, a draft brief that one of my attorneys sent to me without making comments or without changing anything. It's just, and that was not always a reflection of some dissatisfaction on my part. You know, if your name's ultimately going on something, obviously you want to make sure that it reads and is presented in the manner in which you expect it to be. But there may be growth opportunities there that are short of saying you did a terrible job. So it is really important to have that conversation either way. If somebody did a great job, if they did an okay job, or if they did not so good a job, you have the same conversation in any event. But it's important to remember that being critical, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about providing constructive, respectful, and to use the word that Natalie mentioned earlier, kind feedback to advance this employee to help them be where they need to be.
So when we tie this back to the implications that it can have on your DEI efforts, my team and I are regularly listening to employees on a daily basis when we're building DEI strategies. We've had the great and pleasure of talking to employees. And I think at last count, we were at about 40 different countries around the world in terms of their experience at work. And what we hear a lot is that there are cultures that are polite, but not direct. And when you get into conversations, particularly with groups of employees that are identify as in the BIPOC group, which is Black, Indigenous, or people of color, there's this feeling that, well, we can't get ahead because we're not getting real feedback. and we see our white colleagues getting promoted, and like we don't really understand what's missing there. So what ends up happening is you get this perception that an organization that says they're really dedicated to equity, which is part of giving feedback, consistent feedback to everyone, that they're being fake about it, that they don't really mean it. Because if you really meant it, you'd see more Black people promoted, more Latinx people promoted, more women promoted, but they don't really mean it. They're just saying it, it's lip service. Then when you look at this situation of people that are in these underrepresented groups, there's this feeling of otherness where it's, the white person is getting the feedback and they're growing, but I'm sitting over here with the same title that I've had for the past 5 years, and they've had 2 or 3 promotions since that. We are in some of really extreme ways seeing a lack of trust, where we have employees that confide in us that they don't believe that senior leaders are going to do what they say they're going to do. And in worst cases, people who are saying that they don't trust their HR teams. And HR is obviously there to help move a lot of these initiatives along. And if you're getting people who don't believe you, the work, whether it's your day-to-day work or your improvement around your DEI initiatives, just won't get done. I would say trust is one of the top 3 issues that we deal with on a daily basis, and figuring out ways to bridge the obstacles between leaders and staff around this distrust. It's palpable. And if you've ever been in an organization that way, it's so awkward and uncomfortable, and you can feel it in meetings and how people communicate with each other. It also then obviously impacts morale. I have overseen many engagement surveys, and you'll see it come through in engagement, in people's engagement. And engagement is not satisfaction or happiness. Engagement deals with your commitment to sort of the job and the grit it takes to get through it. So then we also end up with a crazy amount of turnover and people being super candid in their exit interviews. I mean, we've had a few exit interviews where people are just super direct, and you're like, holy cow, how did they avoid a lawsuit? They're lucky that they did, based on some of this feedback. And then there's this, as we see here, the setback in a war for talent. The pandemic has greatly changed the workplace and how you find employees. I have a lot of clients that aren't willing to consider remote work once it's safe for people to be back in the office, and they're losing candidates because of it. One of the things that you're seeing, there's a bunch of articles out about what experts are calling the Great Resignation, where we are seeing employees resigning in droves, unlike anything we've seen before. And when you dig down into some of the whys, it is sort of not this idea that employers are not being flexible, one, when it comes to where people work, but also just they don't know what the job is anymore. They're not clear on where they're going with an organization. They're dealing with managers they feel that aren't being truthful or upfront with them, and they'd rather just not work or go find places that at least purport to offer more in that regard. So when you think about the ideas that many companies, as Ray mentioned, since the murder of George Floyd, have come out with bigger and stronger commitments, if you're not monitoring and tracking those commitments alongside this idea of performance feedback and being straight up with people about where they stand, it really can erode or undermine the intent behind your DEI efforts.
Yeah, and that's one area that even prior to the past 18 months, we saw companies struggle with in terms of their DEI. Well, we're doing all these things, but we still have so much turnover with respect to women or BIPOC employees, and we don't know why. Well, that's when you have to really go underneath and examine these types of things to get at where along the life cycle the problems are manifesting themselves, and addressing it proactively, right, before you get the angry exit interview, or the angry post on social media. Boy, am I glad to be out of that company or that organization.
So one of the things that Ray and I talked a bunch about before today was, again, when we think about the fear, where does it come from? And so I always encourage not lawyers, but leaders to really stop and get almost Socratic method themselves, get all the whys to why they're afraid. And really, we get really deep into it in some of these conversations. I mean, we've stopped in the middle of conversations and I'll say, where's the fear coming from? And those actually, when there's trust between the advisor and the client, lead to some really great conversations, all of which are usually things we can definitely find solutions to. So I think that it's obviously important to understand, is it that you're worried about getting canceled? Is it you've always had a really great relationship with the employee and you like the person and you're afraid that by being honest with them, that could erode sort of a good relationship? There's a lot of different reasons, but it's really important when you find yourself frustrated with like repeated poor performance that you're stopping and asking, why am I not saying something to the person about this?
I would also just, Natalie, to add to that, and you may be getting to this, but I think it's really critically important to focus on implicit bias as well, and sort of a self-analysis of where you are. What are your confirmation biases? What are some of the biases that may be interfering with your ability to be a strong and effective manager? And then what are some of those bias interrupters that I can learn about or put into place to minimize this fear that's really founded on misperceptions, perhaps, and stereotypes of folks that should not be in place?
I think I appreciate that. I think there's a really great example that I've heard in more than one occasion, but I'll point out in particular, was dealing with an investigation, and there were two people making complaints about the same manager. One woman was Latinx and part of the LGBTQ community, so that was the basis of her concerns, and one woman was Black, and that was the basis of her concerns. And when I was sitting with the manager, he was speaking about the Black woman and said, generally she's got good performance, but she's got an attitude. And that kind of goes to what Ray is talking about in terms of bias. And I'm like, well, tell me what you mean by attitude. Like, break that down for me, because we know that attitude is a really subjective term. And by the time that he was finished, I was able to share sort of personal examples of when I had gotten similar feedback, and I'm just being myself, and how, there's a more constructive way to have those kinds of conversations with someone. And so I think that it is important to understand, do you think because you have an employee, who might be more direct with you about issues, that's an attitude? And would you feel the same way if you were talking to an employee who was in a different ethnic category or different protected characteristic? And we have this conversation a lot when it comes to, again, if we're listening, going back to all these listening sessions we do, some of the stereotypes that people see in the workplace. For example, in meetings, having women always be the ones to take notes. And how do you interrupt sort of the bias that can come into play there, or that women are the ones who set the meetings or set the agenda? And so I think that there's many examples we could talk through on this, but the idea is the easiest way to deal with some of this is what I say all the time is, if you were looking at your favorite employee who you feel like performs the best, and would you give them the feedback? And if so, why? Why would you give your favorite employee feedback and not someone else? So that's some of the ways that you can help check your own bias. One other thing I could tell you that really helps a lot with checking your own bias when you're dealing with in the workplace is asking yourself a few questions when you see some of these headlines that almost every day we're seeing a headline that somehow touches DEI. For example, if you're seeing a headline that a bank teller at Citibank is filing a sexual harassment claim, and the details of the complaint are really salacious, what is your response? What is your reaction to it? Is your reaction that, laws are in place to protect employees. So, I mean, good for her. And let's see how that works out. Is your reaction, employees in this country always just want to sue and they always just want to get a buck? And why do you react that way? Again, going back to this idea of kind of like the Socratic method, keep asking yourself why, because it does help you in real time, in a minute or two, to start identifying ways in which you may approach certain employee situations with bias. We all have bias. There's no way to eradicate it 100%, but some of it is about how do you put that in check?
Yeah, we have to do some of the hard work, and some of the hard work involves self-educating. I bet there's somebody on this call who may not have realized what saying to a Black woman, you have an attitude problem, what impact that has, and how widespread it is. Frankly, I don't know any professional African-American woman, including myself, who hasn't been told at some point in time, oh, you have an attitude problem, because we've asserted ourselves in the manner in which we've been told is expected of professionals at our level or of our in our place or whatever have you. So I think that point is really well taken, Natalie, just about self-reflection and understanding where your perceptions and beliefs and attitudes are coming from and what you can do to, again, interrupt potential bias.
So I think when we're looking at setting clear performance expectations, I'd like to just offer this, and definitely it's something that, as Ray said, could be a whole different session. But giving performance feedback does not always have to be a heavy lift, right? It does not always have to be some long form that gets filled out. And I think that especially when you're thinking about day-to-day performance feedback, again, I'll come back to using the word expect. It's an easy way to make sure that people understand what you're expecting to get back. And thinking about performance documentation in a lot of different ways, whether it's sending someone a quick email where there's been an issue, whether it's being able to, when we ask for, produce examples of poor work product. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. And I think sometimes people kind of stall because they're like, I don't have time to write all these things up. And every single thing does not have to be documented. And again, you can be creative in doing it. And I think the last thing that we definitely had a long chat about ahead of this is sort of the reality checking and really thinking about what the worst case scenario is of giving direct feedback. My opinion is a worst case scenario is the slide that we had before: losing people, losing their engagement, losing innovation, losing in some instances money because of not dealing with performance issues. Again, I would never want to walk a client into a place where they are getting called out on social media or even a lawsuit, but also we have to kind of always come back to what's best for the organization. We're here to do a job and to push forward on a job. And so I think it's really, really important when you're looking at dealing with performance issues, what's the worst thing that can happen by being, again, direct, but in a way that's, kind and respectful.
Thank you, Natalie. And Ray, we have one quick question, and then we'll ask anyone else who has further questions to reach out individually. But this question is, my team members seem to be defeated when given constructive criticism. In our field, there are many judgment calls for handling, and sometimes it's just a conversation such as, hey, no worries, but do this next time. The team prefers more cheerleading, which is harder to meet. How do you suggest we help with presenting in ways that are received more favorably when there will be tips and more frequent than praise? I guess there'll be more constructive feedback than there would be praise.
Set the expectation that you're going to give feedback from the beginning. When someone's working for you, they should know that you give constructive feedback and they can expect it from you. A really great, easy read in this regard is the 1 Minute Manager. I would say the new 1 Minute Manager, because it's been revised to account for technology, it's called the new 1 Minute Manager. It's about a 60-minute read, and that gives some really great foundation there. But people should know that that's what they can expect from you. If you are constantly nice and you have nice conversations, even if it's not about performance, people can get caught off guard about getting constructive feedback. So if you're in a field where, because of the judgment calls, there's tweaks and things that will consistently be made, which I think is, attributable to the legal profession, and for sure, tell people that up front, right? That sometimes I'm going to give you more feedback than may sound like praise, but it's not because, unless I tell you, it's not because I think you're doing a bad job, but it's how we can do better or improve the work going along. But again, it's being upfront from the beginning that this is how you manage. And so when people hear it, they're not taking it personally.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us for the presentation today. Feel free to reach out individually if you have any further questions. Thanks for sharing your lunch break with us. Everyone have a great day.
Bye-bye.